on the website, thegoldenjackass.com. Jim, welcome, my friend. Good morning.
Oh, good to be on, Will. It's been a while. And as usual, a lot of events are happening. I remember saying a little over a month ago, that the plug has been pulled. Mm-hmm. And now we're starting to see the effect of what happens when the plug has been pulled. The chaos has entered the room.
You could say that
a little
again.
Water down the wrong tube there.
You could say that again, Jim. Today is January 15th, Friday. The markets, the major indices in the U.S. opened, the Dow opened down 400 points, and it's just, the plunge protection team is busily at work. I told Jim earlier, if and he's harped on this in the past, if you watch the intraday, meaning the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., the stock trading, the day itself of trading, and watch, don't just look at how the Dow closed or how it opened. It becomes very evident what's taking place here, and Jim covers it pretty extensively. So let's open with that, Jim, with the stock market and what we're seeing take place.
Well, what I do is I look for the indicators. It's kind of like a weather vane. It was a little over a month ago that Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren said that the too big to fail bank policy is going to go away. And I thought, oh my goodness, really? We should be seeing some very big down days in the stock market soon. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a pretty easy knee-jerk reaction. Then we had another event. We had the Israeli guy who's serving as maybe the hidden central bank chairman, mm-hmm. while Janet Yellen is the puppet chairman, mm-hmm. spokeswoman, perhaps. Anyway, Stanley Fischer came out about 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago and said, the Fed really doesn't have the tools available to manage this huge crisis that's unfolding, or something to that effect. I don't think he was quite as emphatic as my interpretation, but I think my interpretation is very accurate. He was saying that the Fed exhausted many of its tools. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, they've been at 0% for 7 years. Well, yeah, they've been at QE to infinity with lots of bullshit and taper talk lies and hidden QE. They've been at QE for 4 years. We're up to QE 7 now. QE 3 was really the Operation Twist. Mm-hmm. QE 4 was really, QE 4 was really the U.S. stealing the Japanese pension funds from their government workers at $1.2 trillion. QE 5 was really the move to expand QE to the BRICS nations of Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, and Switzerland, where their volume of QE bond purchases equaled the Fed. That's exported QE, so I call it QE 5. Mm-hmm. QE 6 was last year when they resumed, and now I think QE 7 is where they had the fake Fed rate hike. Mm-hmm. I say fake because you're not seeing any significant rise in the effective Fed funds. So once again, the market talks a lot about what the Fed said when they're not looking between the lines and seeing what the market's doing to confirm the words that were uttered by the Fed mouthpieces. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what they really did was they announced, and it was not heard well, that the QE was now going to take on a hidden aspect with the unlimited reverse repos. And the practical side of that, and I didn't figure this out on my own. I mean, many things I do. I admit that I get some things on my own. I get many things on my own. But there are a few that I get only because Rob Kirby and Euroraj blast it out and say, here's what I think's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Rob Kirby thinks that they've now engaged the Exchange Stabilization Fund to cover the dumped treasuries. And I knew something big is going on. I was asking questions. Who's soaking all this up? It must be the Fed. Where's the evidence of it? And Rob said, no, there's no evidence of it because now it's secretive, done with the Exchange Stabilization Fund from the U.S. Department of Treasury, and it's probably unlimited. So here was the hint. In August, September, and October, China dumped $250 billion worth of Treasury bonds.
Mm-hmm.
Will, I ask you, was there an effect on the bond market?
I would imagine we should have seen a massive effect on Treasury yields, right?
Should have gone from 2 to 5%, right?
Maybe, sure.
Or at least 4.5, maybe 4.46.
Yeah.
In fact, it did nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the answer is U.S. Department of Treasury, Exchange Stabilization Fund, and what I call the double-barreled hidden QE to infinity. Double-barreled because it's the Fed now and Department of Treasury. Okay, so we had all these different indications. The Fed came out and said they're going to do a rate hike, and the market gets a little spooked. I think they did the rate hike because the Wall Street firms have their massive shorts in place.
Mm-hmm.
As Rubin, well, I don't think it was Rubin who said it. I don't know who said it, but it's a great quote. Never let a crisis go to waste.
Right.
Might have been Rubin. I don't think it was Rubin. Do you know who it was? It might have been Paulson or
Yeah, it was
Jamie Dimon. One of those pieces of garbage who walk on two legs and claim to be human. All right, so I think with the advance warning that the Fed was not going to do what it usually does in bailing out the banks, and with the rate hike, and with the hidden Fed chairman from Israel telling us that we don't have tools available to handle this anymore, what they're admitting is that we have a systemic Lehman event unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
And the stock market's going to be the first to go because that's where the idiots usually do their trading.
Mm-hmm.
People who have their mutual funds, they don't change their positions except for maybe once or twice a year and don't really pay much attention except the end of the month. They're the perfect sheep to shear.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see it. My gosh, if we don't see a 3,000 or 4,000 point drop in the next several weeks, I'll be shocked for the Dow. I actually pay more attention to the S&P because that's where your big contracts are played.
Mm-hmm.
That's where your S&P futures are played. If you want to see, remember back in June of the year 2000. Can you remember back then, Will? I don't know what you were doing, but do you remember Robert Rubin? Robert Ruin? That's a nice Freudian slip, huh? You remember Robert Rubin resigned from the Clinton II administration's Treasury Secretary post?
Mm-hmm. I personally don't, because back then, Jim, I wasn't even really paying attention to much of this stuff. I was like most Americans are today, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was busy losing some tech stock wealth. But in June, I immediately concluded, June 2000, I said, this is unprecedented. Looks like Robert Rubin wants to go out and short the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't want the nuisance and noise from the Department of Treasury offices. Instead, he wanted to go to his little hidden office at Citigroup and short the stock market.
Yep.
And maybe even help the Clinton administration make positive statements to the press to maximize his gains. In other words, deceptive comments like the stock market will come back, drawing in more dumb money.
Right.
Okay. So, anyway, we're going to see more big down days, and I think the norm is going to be an opening big down. And then the norm is going to be a midday recovery. Then the norm is going to be closing down hard.
Yeah.
This is how things move in an orderly fashion. And I don't see any exception to this, except some major shocks coming, Will.
Mm-hmm.
We're now sub 30 oil, and I was calling for this a month ago. I was saying that I did a few interviews. It was about a month ago. I did some other interviews. I said the oil price is going to fall, but I got more specific with about 3 or 4 interviews that took place in the Christmas holidays.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying specifically, and this is kind of an echo of The Voice. The Voice said, look for sub $30 oil and look for some rather grievous consequences quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote and said, you mean like a big bank failure? And he said, yes, it could be the start of a contagion. But if you're looking for fuses to light, the sub 30 oil price is as good as any.
Interesting. And Jim, you've covered in detail the massive derivative contracts in oil and how so much of the energy sector of the overall markets never anticipated sub $80 oil, let alone sub $30 oil. So none of these hedges were in place. In fact, I've got some folks that I know with a private wealth group that are actually right now they're buying productive oil and gas leases in South Texas at pennies on the dollar. They're already in production and they're hedging against further downside. And so I mean, these guys are buying these distressed assets and hedging against the downside on $30 oil. You've covered it extensively. How many derivative contracts? How much of this funny money that was not hedged for an oil shock like this? And now it's coming unfolded, and the banks should be the ones that take the massive hit on these contracts.
Yes, the banks are going to take hits on these contracts, but it's 3 things they're going to take hits on. And the first is underwriting the oil hedges. I mean, we all know very well that a smart, well-run oil company would hedge on the oil price, and as it descends, they're not hurt.
Mm-hmm.
What's a zero-sum game? Who is hurt? It's the big banks.
Right.
And I think that's part of what the hidden $1 trillion per month QE was all about this autumn. The Fed was doing $1 trillion a month in hidden QE.
Unbelievable.
And I think it was to help the big banks to take care of all their all their oil hedge underwriting losses. Okay, the second thing they're going to lose on is the marginal oil businesses, and now marginal is pretty much everything. I mean, gosh, this is a lot more than the shale sector from the oil industry. Mm-hmm. This is a lot more. I mean, take a look at most energy output for conventional oil, and it's like, $50, $60, $70, $80 cost per barrel.
Wow.
A lot of this is now marginal.
Mm-hmm.
And marginal is a nice word for broken.
Yeah.
Wow. Devastated. Okay, the banks are in on that. All right, so the banks have a lot of credit portfolio activity with these firms. What are they lending against? It's capital equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Is this viable capital equipment anymore?
I guess not.
I don't think
if it's producing at a loss, no.
Right, but it might be producing at a loss with some hedges put on.
Right.
When it was down to 80 or 70. But, take a look at that path, and it was a rather quick move down toward 50.
Mm-hmm.
It was so quick that I don't know how many legitimate oil firms, regardless of their type, had opportunities to hedge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing that January, February, March is when these hedges come off. Mm-hmm. They expire. And when you've got a smart $100 oil hedge put on from 16 months ago, you cannot do the same again. You're going to have to do a hedge at 30.
And that insurance is probably going to cost you quite a bit.
No, it's worse than that. Not only would it cost you quite a bit, no, I don't know about whether it costs a lot. That's not the point, I think. The point is they can't make money at 30, so why hedge at 30?
Right, there's nothing to hedge.
They can't hedge at their cost.
Right.
Plus a profit. They can't hedge at 78. Those days are gone. Now, it was a quick move from 100 to 50, so did they put the hedge on for 75 when they could have? I think they were in shock.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're going to see a big bank go down. And what's different? I mean, I like making the micro-macro argument here. When I took economics, when I was in college, I loved microeconomics. I thought it was fascinating. Mm-hmm. I wanted to take another, but instead my advisor said, take introductory macro now. And I thought, okay, this is dull, but somewhat interesting. Okay, then I took intermediate micro, and I loved it. Then I took intermediate macro, and I absolutely hated it. But what I walked away with was a good, solid impression that the theory of the firm, which is microeconomics, is not the same in any way, shape, or form as the theory of the country, which is macroeconomics. Mm-hmm. So we have micro cases and we have macro cases. And right now the macro case is that the oil industry is going into the shitter. Mm-hmm. The oil industry has new threats just in the last 2 or 3 months that can bring the oil price to 20 and lower. And what I find amazing is that the clowns out there who purport to be financial analysts and experts are really continuing to be financial promotion experts mm-hmm. and propaganda tools for the exposed big banks. Mm-hmm. We're hearing things like, well, look, back in 2009, the oil price rebounded rather quickly. Okay. Back then, did Iran have permission suddenly to unleash 1 million barrels a day on the market? No. Back then, did the U.S. government forego and push to the side its export ban? No. Those are the two big new threats. Back then, were the Arab Emirates running at deficits? Mm-hmm. No.
And Jim, what about the House of Saud right now? Looks to be on its knees. I mean, is that a factor that plays in as well?
Isn't it a wonderful thing to watch? These are some of the biggest scum merchants in the modern era.
Yep.
They have stolen and Bogart, I'd love that back in my don't Bogart that joint, Jim, you know. I love that phrase. They're Bogarting. They've had 50 years of hoarding the wealth from Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. It's not just them. It's UAE, it's Oman, it's Bahrain, it's Qatar, it's Kuwait. Mm-hmm. All these Arab Emirates. Simple question, Will. Where's their dependence for continuing their monarchy?
Petrodollar.
How do you think their regimes are going to survive?
Well, they're not.
I don't think they are. The Voice has made a very plain statement to me. We were talking about the threat to all these Arab monarchies, mm-hmm. These petro-monarchies, and he said every single one of them will fall.
Yeah.
The ones that are dependent on the oil price will fall. They're going to experience, and you know, we continue the discussion. I go off in my own direction, but my direction is that they're all dealing with deficits now that they're not accustomed to. Mm-hmm. So they're not able to buy more Spanish property. They're not able to buy more London condominiums and condominiums. Condominio is Spanish. Condominiums nor high-rise buildings. Mm-hmm. So what are the Arabs doing? Well, they're busy trying to put together bond sales. and they're busy trying to defend their decisions for funding ISIS in Syria and supporting the the Saudi army in Yemen. And both of them are going badly. You've got Iran, basically the supporting agent for the Yemeni, I don't know how they pronounce it. And you have the Russians basically demolishing ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq. You know, we're going to get out of this up north. I'll touch on Turkey first and then Yemen next. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
What we're going to get is a fall of the Erdogan regime in Turkey. Russia is going to do its dead level best to pull a lever here, pull a string there, move away an entire platform over yonder, and before you know it, the Turkish military is going to say, we're taking over, you idiot, you're wrecking our country. And if you don't think if you don't think the Turkish economy is a mess, then you don't know anything about currencies. I mapped out the currency in November, maybe it was October. The months blur a little bit, but in the last 2 or 3 months, in the newsletter, Hat-Trick Letter, I mapped out the threat following the Erdogan re-election, which is probably full of fraud, just like Obama's and Bush's. We export a lot of things, but we also export, in addition to military weapons, we export methods to rig an election.
Fraud. Fraud.
Or they might just do what they did in Nicaragua and just eliminate an entire county from its vote. That vote just never made it. Never made it to the counting process. Anyway, Turkey is going to survive by ousting Erdogan and trying to win global favor on their currency before too much more damage takes place. And that's the big question. How long will they wait? Because every month, every week that they wait in Turkey to remove this U.S. puppet, this terror agent involved in heavy-duty heroin from the U.S. military coming from Afghanistan, all through the NATO air bases. The longer they wait, the bigger the damage. The more the damage, the higher the prices will be from a collapsed Turkish lira currency. Okay. We're going to see redrawn borders for Turkey. That's going to be their punishment for allowing the U.S. to use the U.S. Embassy in Ankara as the ISIS field operations headquarters. They're going to be punished for being involved with ISIS black market oil, which, by the way, London and Wall Street buys. They make money off it. These are fascists. They don't care whether it's stolen war zone gold or oil. If they could transport the gas more easily, they'd buy that too. So we're going to see redrawn Turkish borders. I think we're going to see it. I'm not alone in this. We're going to see a new Kurdistan state.
Jim,
and it's going to have some Turkish land, and it's going to have some Iraqi land, and it's going to end some of this nasty, constant war that the U.S. loves.
Jim, what can you speak to? Who the force behind this may be? I mean, the force of good, or
Sure. Russia and China.
All the trade partners.
Russia and China.
Yeah.
We got a new deal that I don't like mentioning Ben Fulford much because anyone who comes from a Jesuit background, I suspect, is a bit of a, let's just say, closet Satanist and pro-Vatican person.
Okay.
I don't know how much more to say about that, but he's now coming out and saying, and he's not alone, there's some U.S. military retirees who have publications out there.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm hearing, what I'm reading, and this is not just Fulford, so that's why I mention him, because he's getting some confirmation. There's apparently some kind of an alliance between what we are calling the Pentagon white hats. They tend to be members of the U.S. military who actually believe in the Constitution, as opposed to the Bush and Clinton and Obama types who swear their loyalty to narcotics. They're called the loyalists, and Clinton began that purge a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
He also downed a plane in Alabama
Yep.
About 1 month before the Oklahoma City incident.
Yep.
And the plane in Alabama contained 8 or 7 generals and admirals
Yep.
who wanted to restore the Constitution and remove Clinton from power. So instead, Clinton hired Bush to kill them.
Hopefully.
And now that event is not even in the press, nor is it in the Pentagon annals. That's how completely they eliminated that threat.
Hopefully these gentlemen aren't traveling in packs anymore.
They don't travel in packs anymore, yes. In fact, they changed the entire protocol as a result of the Alabama incident. And there was something in the Murrah building that got destroyed. And if you think that fertilizer in a truck outside the Murrah building of Oklahoma City knocked out 1/3 of the structural steel in the building in 1995, you qualify as a moron.
Can we say micro nukes, Jim?
No, it was just 100 pounds of C-Max.
Mm-hmm.
It was all planted to go off at the same time that the truck was exploded.
Micro nukes are
The
safe.
truck had less than 1 ton of fertilizer explosives, which would really ruin the paint job on the building, and
Maybe-
nothing more.
Maybe blast a window or two.
Oh, I should, thanks for pointing that out. Ruin the paint job and destroy a lot of windows and maybe a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But not ruin any structural steel. I mean, take a look at the pictures of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's 100 pounds of C-Max. Anyway, all right, what I'm driving at is the Pentagon white hats now have an anti-Obama element. I mentioned a year and a half ago or 2 years ago something that my source Cato told me. He said, Jim, when the Pentagon regulars encounter the mercenaries from Langley, that's when shit hits the fan in the Pentagon, causing a deep division, and they will oppose the president. We're there now. So apparently we got an element called the Pentagon White Hats that have already made agreements with the Kremlin in Russia and with China. And I believe that there's going to be an emerging movement in Iran to team up with Russia and China, providing China with energy, but working together with Russia on price setting and pipeline construction. There's a commonality between Ukraine and Syria. Ukraine was to block the Gazprom Russian energy pipelines, gas pipelines to serve Europe. U.S. did not want a European marriage with Russia.
Right.
The Syrian war is to block the Iranian pipeline from reaching Europe and the Mediterranean coast first. And who are the principal blockers for that? Well, it's Qatar, the ones who are involved with LNG. LNG, I've come to learn, is about 50% more expensive than gas from a pipeline like from Iran. And the Saudis got in the way too, because these Arab Emirates work together.
Right.
Well, it was about a year and a half or so ago that the Iran pipeline, it was called the Iran-Pakistani pipeline, was interrupted, strangely, by the Saudis. They said, we're not going to fund the contractors. Okay, so the U.S. got a favor from the Saudi royals to interfere with the Pakistan pipeline from Iran. Okay, well then China funded it, and I think China arranged for alternate contractors for its construction. So the Saudis were trumped. Okay, we got all these things going on. I mean, it's like geopolitical chess, but now there's a new alliance apparently with the Russians and the Chinese and the White Hat Pentagon. And this is very, very big because it opposes the State Department in the United States government, which is run by the neocons, which is a nice word for neo-Nazis, who believe in constant war. And our efforts, the U.S. efforts in Syria, they're not to knock out ISIS strongholds. They're to wreck the infrastructure. And now we have the UN ambassador from Syria taking to the stump, pointing out all the infrastructure damage done by the U.S. Air Force. The Aleppo electricity generating plant, bridges, water supply centers. Okay. We're calling these ISIS targets in the U.S. press, Will.
Unreal.
We got some opposition. It's forming. I think it's got some critical mass. And if you're looking for a U.S. government event that confirms it, look no further than the mid-December meeting in the Kremlin with Secretary of State Kerry. He took his reconstructed jaw there. He met with Putin and their Foreign Minister Lavrov. Gosh, I wish the United States had some strong leaders like Russia does. Instead, we got this gay heroin addict.
They're criminals, Jim. They're not leaders. They're criminals.
President, and our foreign minister is a guy with a reconstructed jaw who married into Heinz family wealth and decided to become a New World Order captain. And his reward is being Secretary of State. My gosh, these people are not out for the U.S. popular interests. All right, so what did Kerry do in the Kremlin? Complete 180-degree about face.
Really?
Yes, he said, we no longer in the U.S. government, despite what Obama says, we no longer require Assad to step down as Syrian leader. Number two, we will request with urgency that the Turkish military evacuate Syria and northern Iraq. 180-degree about face. Okay, just 3 weeks before, Obama said, our line in the sand is King Assad or President. I love when they call him President Assad. He's the king who managed to rig an election to call himself president. All right, so King Assad, I call him king because he's a king. Okay, we don't call President Salman, we didn't call President Fahd, and we didn't call it President Abdullah of the Saudis. These are kings.
Right.
Obama said right around December 1st, he repeated, our line in the sand is Assad must go. What a weak-kneed little piece of garbage we have sitting in the White House. And I mean, he's got two job description functions. Play golf and attend fundraisers, which he's good at. I don't know that he's a good golfer, but I think he's got some things that are going to eventually come out, and that is his somewhat out of control gay parties in the White House. The Secret Service just, it leaves them a bad taste in the mouth.
Yeah. Interesting. That's one. That's
one
I haven't seen on CNN yet, Jim.
Pardon me?
That can't be true. I haven't seen that one on CNN yet.
Well, you've probably seen a couple photos of Michelle, who was born Michael Robinson, 1983 Oregon State football middle linebacker. You've probably seen pictures of Michael
thought those were some
By
broad
the way,
shoulders.
Obama has called Michelle Michael on 4 different public occasions.
Really? I didn't know that.
In the Rose Garden after a long trip. Oh, Michael and I are really happy to be back home. I mean, Michelle.
Wow.
In front of the Joint Chiefs in a military big podium speech, referred to Michael and I, and 2 other occasions. In fact, he made a speech and and stuttered over his own words, and it just goes viral on YouTube. And then you got idiots like my brother says I'm a big fan, and all this is just propaganda lies. So I sent him a picture of Michael on stage with, how should you call it, a bad choice of wardrobe. He didn't have his usual empire waist that would obscure his giant package below the waistline. In fact, this sheer green dress exposes the fact that he has no mammary glands and a rather substantial package below his belt line, because a gust of breeze must have just thrust its way onto stage, where he immediately realized, bad choice in dress. No, I tell you, I think this is going to come out soon. There's reportedly a CD of a gay sex party that Harry Reid attended in the White House. It's floating around Harlem right now.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, this is just a mockery. This is a sick mockery of our country.
Putin calls them mutants.
Yeah.
Would you say that he's wrong or on target?
Oh, very on target, yeah.
Right. Okay, well, anyway, we got a new alliance that's forming. And I'd like to see it grow within the U.S. military. But, let's face it, they've got a job to protect the heroin and poppy fields, the transportation of the heroin, the growing of the poppy fields in Afghanistan, and the chemical plant processing. They've made it at an industrial level. You see movies of the Colombian cartel and a bunch of wild-eyed guys with with pants rolled up to their waists and, in other words, bare legs stomping on liquid solutions.
Yeah, and tents set up all over the jungle.
Tents set up and women in bra and panties so they can't, hide any product as they go home. It can easily be inspected. This is standard operating procedure in the cocaine laboratories. The U.S. has cocaine and heroin factories with trucks transporting chemicals in support of this in Afghanistan. And if you're wondering, what was that incident all about with Doctors Without Borders being bombed in Kabul? What a horrible incident. Well, there's an explanation for that. The Doctors Without Borders was taken over by the Bush crime family and turned into a heroin transportation distribution center.
Wow.
And it got bombed by the good element.
Say that again, by the good?
By the good element.
Yeah.
They wanted to interfere with. There's a lot of interruption now of the Bush and Saudi heroin. Notice that a Saudi prince was arrested in Beirut about a month ago with 32 boxes of heroin. He'll never see a day of jail. He'll just get a warning to be more careful next time. This is how ISIS was being paid.
Right.
The guerrillas are being paid. They also get paid from black market oil sales done to Wall Street, London banks, and Erdogan, Turkish president's son. Okay, these are being interrupted. Now here's where it gets kind of weird and comes back home. I'm hearing that there's a lot of interrupted narcotics flow that has been supporting the U.S. stock market.
Holy cow. Unbelievable. Well, one would have to, at one point you have to wonder, where does the liquidity come from? Where does the cash, where does the money come from to support this massive multi-trillion-dollar facade that is being supported, as you mentioned in your last article, in every facet of finance, from currencies to commodities, namely gold and silver, to major stock indices, to bonds. Where does it all come from?
And also to the Wall Street bank liquidity flow. They get a 15 to 20% cut as profit for managing the narcotics money flow. And this is not, wild-eyed commentary. Mm-hmm. There have been 2 reports put out by the United Nations Drug Task Force stating that following the Lehman incident in early 2009, the U.S. banks in New York would have entered failure without the narcotics money laundering.
Wow.
So ditto for London. These 2 groups of banks, they operate with the same modus operandi. All right, so now we're having the Fed perhaps pulling back on its stock support at the same time that the Bush and Saudi narcotics channels are being interrupted that had been diverted in some part toward also the U.S. stock support. Mm-hmm. That's a double-barreled, how shall I say it, a 2-fisted pullout of rugs. Mm-hmm. 2 different rugs pulled out from 2 different arms for the U.S. stock market. Now, maybe they're going to be having to rely more heavily on the Working Group for Financial Markets, which is closely aligned with the Department of Treasury Exchange Stabilization Fund.
Right.
That's what I expect. But the alliance of the White Hats, Russia, and China, I think is going to expand. I think it's already somewhat expanded to Germany. The Germans have announced, this is now not new. It's been a month. They're going to work closely with the Russian military and eradicate the ISIS threat. Okay, Germany's a NATO nation working with Russia on the Syrian battlefield, knocking out Langley-supported troops. And they're NATO. Okay, this is what Cato was warning about 2 years ago. We now have NATO and elements of NATO working against the U.S. military, working against Langley. Now, they weren't directly hitting U.S. military targets. They were hitting targets that the U.S. military refused to hit.
Right.
There were a list of 200 ISIS targets on the board, and Russia said, why in the last 2 years hasn't the U.S. military taken any of them out? And the U.S. kind of sheepishly and embarrassingly said, well, we have other targets. Yeah, like the Aleppo electricity generating station, like the Western Syrian water treatment center. Those are not ISIS stronghold targets. All right, it's not just Germany. The French are working closely with the Russians too. It's not just them. Like the cowards that the British are. I don't like them, okay? I'm sorry. There are a lot of British clients I have. I don't like the British elite. I don't like the British government. I don't like the British bankers. I don't like the British military.
Okay, we know where you stand.
I like the British people. What?
We know where you stand there.
I like the British people. Yeah. They're upset like I am. But Cameron had a secret meeting that The Voice told me about. The Voice is not just a gold trader. He's an international consultant in business, business finance, investments, whatever. He helped set up the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund to operate independently of the central bank. That's where they're going to buy gold bullion. All right. Anyway, The Voice told me that Cameron had a secret meeting with President Hollande of France. Yeah. And what they decided was how to use the British pledge of weapons support and logistics support that Britain would provide through the French corridor to fight ISIS. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So the British are also operating against NATO.
Interesting.
I think we're seeing the fractures of NATO here. And what I like to point out when it comes to NATO and instability of that alliance, it's a war alliance. It's not a security alliance anymore. Mm-hmm. It's a war alliance, it's a heroin alliance, and it's a terrorism alliance.
Yep.
What I like to point out is that if we have fractures there, and if, say, Turkey is in the midst of a military coup, what's going to happen to the Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey as it relates to NATO? And what's going to happen to the heroin that goes through there? We're not talking about a little bit of heroin. We're talking about 1,300 tons a year coming out of Afghanistan alone.
I can't even wrap my head around that. Is there a dollar estimate on like street value?
Yeah. 800 billion to 1 trillion.
A year.
A year.
Wow.
You can buy a lot of senators with that.
Oh, you could buy a lot. Holy cow.
Right. You can also buy a lot of, how shall I say, Central American country presidents and central banks.
Mm-hmm.
So that they're not prepared for the reset and the other side.
Interesting. Well, the Germany, the flipping of Germany is something that you've covered in detail now for a while. Starting, back with when the spying, the NSA spying data, information came out, and it was revealed that Merkel, we were just spying on Merkel, and it was all political spying. And
well, it was really post-Ukraine.
Post-Ukraine.
It was the spring and summer of 14 after Ukraine, while these things that you mentioned were happening also.
Yes, and now we see, I read a Zero Hedge article like 6-8 weeks ago to the effect that in Germany, pepper spray, you couldn't get pepper spray. It was back ordered, and it was because of massive demand, because of this crisis. There's 1 million migrants now or more that Germany has allowed in, and cities are on fire. There are massive rapes taking place. Women are being warned to travel in groups and to avoid migrant men in lots of areas in Europe, namely Germany and Sweden. So Germany's under attack under many different facets, and this flipping only makes sense. How do you see the whole migrant crisis playing into this thing too?
Well, it's part of the terrorism stuff. I actually forecasted in October that with all the refugee influx into Europe, Western Europe in particular, that we were going to see some rather significant terrorist events, explosive events, murders, whatever, in public places. And it began, I believe, in late November with Paris.
Yep.
And if you're wondering, let me just throw a couple of details out about the Paris murders. The first was a woman named Jimena, a Mexican woman. She witnessed some of the attack and was brought into let's call it official custody, because I don't think it was police.
Okay. Official
custody, namely the French security agencies that work very closely with the British and American.
Yep.
All right, so she made a phone call to her boyfriend in Mexico City saying, all is well, I saw some murders and it's pretty messy here. Mm-hmm. She was found among the dead victims.
After the phone call, obviously.
Like all the rest.
Yep.
After the phone call from official custody.
Yep.
That's what you call a big oops.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there was also more. There was some high-level meetings between the French security organizations and the director of U.S. security organizations the day before. That's to coordinate things.
Yeah.
Coordinate responses. And I'd like to mention also that the downing in Gaza of that airplane, they made a point not to say that they thought it was terrorism, so that in the first 24 hours, no borders had high alert.
Mm-hmm.
So the perpetrators all escaped from standard border crossings. Then 2 days later, they added that we suspected it might have been a terrorist incident. Mm-hmm. So after the barn door was closed and the horses were gone, they locked the barn doors.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was much the same in Paris. A bunch of different men were let through borders, and questions were raised. And how do I feel about this? I forecasted in October that we would have extensive terrorist incidents because I expected about 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 to be a really nasty type.
Yep. And
what we got was a whole lot more.
Yeah.
I got a message that took me totally off guard from a client in Italy. I'm talking about hat-trick letter client. I got them all over the place.
Yeah.
76 countries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and some are very minor, like Lithuania and Malta and whatever. But I've got a bunch of clients from Italy.
Sure.
I've got 100 or more from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
My highest per capita of the foreign countries appears to be Australia. They're just very interested in mining and gold and things like that.
Right.
As they lose control of their country to become a Chinese colony. Okay, so I got an email from Italy from a woman, and it wasn't perfect English, but it was very good, made the point, and I quoted her, cleaned up the English, and didn't change her meaning at all. But she said, Jim, it's all over the minor gazettes here that these are not Syrians. That they're what they call black Africans from the north.
Right.
They're Moroccan. They're Libyan.
Right.
And she said, of the ones that have really been examined for their background, 3/4 of them have very serious criminal records. So, back to my micro-macro, which I love. Do you remember the 1993 Mariel boat incident in Florida where Fidel dumped all kinds of criminals straight out of the Cuban prisons?
No.
Mariel, called the Mariel Boat People.
Mm-hmm.
A couple hundred prisoners were allowed to leave and make the 90-mile trek to Florida, where they overwhelmed the system. And the Americans didn't know what to do. The U.S. government didn't know what to do. The governor of Florida didn't know what to do. They're all criminals.
I do remember this, yes.
What do you do with a murderer from Havana who comes to Florida for a new life?
You give him a room, you give him socks and food and a television set. I mean, this is the insanity that is taking on mass
That's the insanity of Europe. But that was not the insanity of the Mariel. The Mariel, they ended up in detention centers. Okay, so if the micro incident, was Mariel boat people in Florida in 93, the macro is the flood of people from North Africa and some Syria flooding Western Europe, where I raised the question in November, who's paying for their passage?
Yes, you did.
We would see people on boats, a standard little freighter, a 200-foot freighter with 10,000 people hanging on the rafters. And we saw pictures that broke your heart of kids trying to swim, and you knew they weren't going to make it.
Yep.
There were boats that capsized. There were boats that were overflowed. There were boats where people fell off. Okay, I asked the question, who's paying their passage?
Yeah.
Because I am a senior pragmatist who bothers the hell out of teachers and speakers by asking questions that they don't want to answer because it exposes the corruption to the message. The answer was U.S. government NGOs.
Like Soros.
So Soros and other NGOs were paying for passage to send human sewage to Western Europe. And And now I got a picture from a German client. It's a protest movement in Cologne, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not welcome, it says,
Mm-hmm.
to the refugees. These are really, I hate calling them refugees.
Right.
These are people who are escaping the Langley-sponsored and the Israeli Mossad-sponsored terrorism.
Yep.
Who are having their passage paid by the U.S. government, various organizations.
Wrapped up in more terrorist agenda by the same axis of evil.
Right, and there's a real purpose to the NGOs, and it's a nice acronym given to a very ugly movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's to protect the villains in the U.S. government who are doing nasty deeds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes it's not even clear that an NGO is Soros's.
Right.
And then later it gets exposed because he has a lot of enemies. So this is some really, really nasty stuff going on. And